We're the Mississippi Education Reform Collaborative, MERC. It's a group of superintendents who've come together to work collaboratively to do what's best for children and their communities. They pool resources, share ideas. It's a place for educators to learn and grow. Today is the third of 5 of our leadership series. Today is called Education and Economic Development in Mississippi. We've brought an economist and economic historian and an economist to talk about the role of education and the economy in economic development. It's our opportunity to give educators a chance to see that as important as learning your 1 + 1 = 2, it's also important to see the larger context of what that looks like in communities and how education can be leveraged to create jobs, not just for the individuals, but to transform communities.
Message here today is that the economy has become divided into the rich and the poor, and the middle class is vanishing. And the way to get from the lower level to the higher level is through education. And so we need to think about what is appropriate for the education of rural Mississippian students. So what does the concept of the dual economy consist of? And he argued that in a lot of developing countries, in countries that were just beginning out in the process of industrialization in the early part of the 20th century, there are 2 sectors, one of which was the modern sector, capitalist he called it, where you had factories and the kind of economy we think of today, and the other one was subsistence. And this was for economies which had essentially large populations of sharecroppers or other poor farmers who were doing this. And so it just led to a dual economy. Now, how did they relate to each other? What does it mean to be a dual economy in the context of being a single economy? Well, you could make the transition from the subsistence economy to the capitalist economy by going to the city, which is where the capitalists and the factories and everything were. And so you could go up there, and people would go up there because they had a higher expected wage. And the term expected wage is one of the economics jargon, so I've explained it there. It's the higher wage that you can get in the capitalist sector times the probability that even though you make this transition or try to make this transition, that you actually do get a job. And so Dr. Hammer was talking about unemployment earlier, and that's how it comes into this model, and I'll come back to that for that. So, okay. So how do we apply that to today? What does that look like from the point of view today? Because it's a model of a developing country, so that the model was setting off to be optimistic, whereas the American economy, I'm maintaining, is kind of moving backwards in this intellectual historical sense, toward going from a better economy backwards into the condition of a dual economy. And so I call the upper sector today the FTE sector, emphasizing the parts of it, finance, technology, electronics, for that, which are the kind of drivers of what's happening today. And if you think back about the context in which Lewis wrote in the 1950s, that's 60 years ago, he would have put manufacturing. But as we all know, manufacturing in the United States has been decreasing very much to be replaced by these kinds of activities. And the earnings in the sector took off in the 1980s. So thank you. That happens in my classes too, so I know all about it. Okay. And the low-wage sector, which includes then, if we go back to this, the low-wage sector is then the combination of the middle who've been forced down into this and the lower groups of the Pew Foundation. There, 80%. And the transition is not by going to the city, because it's not the economies of scale from having manufacturing production for that, but by education. And that is the link then between my concern about what's happening to the economy again and your concerns here about education in Mississippi. And so the argument, as I've developed it, is that students need a college education to go into the FTE sector. So if you look at the top line of this slide, you can appreciate that people need to have some skills in this kind of thing. But of course, education does much more of that, which I will talk about. And I want to also give a note of caution here, which is college education is necessary. That is to say, students need to have the skills and the ability to do technical things to join the FTE sector, to get a job there. But it's not sufficient. That is to say, it's not a guarantee that you will get there. It's not an automatic process. It's a process that goes on over time. So we will talk more about that. Now, the politics of the dual economy are a little scary, because the FTE policy makes policy for itself, and it pretty well ignores what's going on in the low-wage sector. And Dr. Hammer gave preference to Milton Friedman, an economist, about this. But the economist, I mean, I'm an economist, and I would love to have economists rule the world. But there's some impediments there. And so this is being led also by a set of businessmen who have a kind of ideology rather than a kind of economic model of this for that, which harks back to Hayek earlier, to Ayn Rand today, and coming up, in which Milton Friedman represented a step, and a fairly technical one, in this process, but was kind of in the high tide of this. So the top 1%, you've seen that phrase around, the 1%, so on, dominates politics, come to figure. And what do they want? You know, when they make policy for themselves, they want low taxes. So the fact that, you know, our roads, our bridges, our trains, and so on are falling apart, our educational system is falling apart, that doesn't concern them. All they want is smaller government for that. Research shows that, citing in that. But now this process shown in my slide has gone so far that we can talk about the 1% of the 1%. You know, that's a very small group of people, but they have political power too. And you could see that in the Republican debates, not by the content. Oh, you could also see that, but I don't want to get into that. but just by the sheer number of people that got into these debates, so that everybody had to figure out how to reduce it to manageable size for it, because a candidate from the right only needs to have a few very, very rich people, billionaires, who to spend a couple of $1 million to finance a candidate is no big deal. It's the way you go to the corner store, you know, so that they could do that, so that we had this proliferation. So that's a kind of graphic illustration of how the 1% of the 1% is dominating our politics for it. So it's the candidates for the president. It's also conservative state governors, because after Citizens United, a Supreme Court decision in 2010, some of these very rich people in the top 1% of 1% realized that their money could go, you know, they're not stupid. They thought about it, and they realized that their money could go further, even though I'm saying it's not all their money by any manner of means, and that they go further in local elections. Democrats, we like to think, are intelligent too, but they were a little slow off the mark in this thing. And so they, 1% of the 1%, poured money into state elections and got a lot of conservative state governors. And then finally, just to summarize this, if you're the top 1% of the 1%, you don't drive on the same roads, you don't take the trains, you don't live in the areas that other people live in. And so they have no contact. So let me close this part with a few numbers. Here's the 1% in numbers. This is data from Thomas Piketty, who wrote a big book on this topic. From that, and you can see what happened, and you see the period. Can't see how old you all are, but the period I grew up in for all of this, and then took a sharp rise up starting in the 1980s for that. And if you look, that's the top 1%, which has been in the news. If you looked at the top 1% of the 1%, the curve would be even steeper. Mississippi is, as always, to engage parents in with their children's education, and then to try through a variety of things to engage the students.
I think the session today was an extraordinary explanation or excavation of what the price of inequality in the state of Mississippi happens to be. And that inequality shows up in schools, and it shows up in the workplace, it shows up in the wealth distribution among citizens in the state, and it also offered up some remedies, things that people could actually do, right, to sort of change the inequalities as they exist in the economic landscape. The biggest thing that happened for me today was it reaffirmed the purpose of the education enterprise, period, right? I mean, we're in education primarily for the purposes of building a strong economy for everyone, not just select people. And I think our presenters today did an exquisite job of helping folks understand why this work needs to be done. It's not being done for the purposes of someone getting a low-wage job. It's for the purposes of elevating the entire economy in local communities and throughout the state of Mississippi. It's an amazing morning from my point of view.
I think it's very important that we think about critical thinking skills, right? So when you have that curious child in your class, here's another opportunity for a narrative. Perhaps we don't call Johnny that worrisome kid who's always asking me 50 million questions. And we all have a Johnny, right? But perhaps we think about the fact that Johnny is asking me questions means that Johnny is actually astute at looking at the world, right? Johnny is going to be the student who's going to recognize, why doesn't this clicker, for example, have a timer on it? So that in the event that I need to stick to a 30-minute talk, here's a timer that's going to tell me when my time is up. When Johnny recognizes that, maybe Johnny then has the motivation to create a clicker that now has a timer, right? Perhaps Johnny will look at his community and recognize what services are not being provided. That's going to encourage Johnny to potentially be an entrepreneur, right? Because he's thinking. Now, I also recognize, as we're thinking about testing and that we have material that we need to cover for the test, there's minimum space for us to have our students to question. Because if you're questioning too much, you might read the test and begin to question and bubble the wrong answer. And that has consequences for not only the student, but the school district. So where do we find that balance in terms of teaching critical skills, or I should say nurturing them, but nurturing them in a context that does not have negative consequences for the child? Rote skills. These are the skills, like I said, that are easily offshored, right? Offshored or automated. Caregiving skills. As we have an aging population, we're going to need more of this. But here's what I think is going to be the key. How do we combine these in a manner that becomes valuable to a community? So how do I encourage a student to question? How do I then get them to think about, if it is indeed rote skills, how are you that person that might be the company that is doing the offshoring, so that you're not always just being offshored, but you could have the relationship with the companies on the other side? For example, my students talk to me about how companies now don't have personal assistants that are in the US. They have personal assistants that are abroad because it's cheaper. And when you first think about that, it's like, how can you be my personal assistant if you're not right here beside me? Because we think about, quite often, what does my personal assistant do? They manage my calendar. They make sure that I get to certain places on time. And a smartphone and the app with Google or something else will let me know where I need to be. I don't need you here. Okay? Or they are doing things like having transcriptions on tapes, sending that overseas, lower wage, typing it up and send it back. Can you be that person for the rote skills that is building that relationships with organizations overseas and yet create jobs in your community? And both of those I have just said. So I am happy sort of to answer questions, and I would say to you, for me, the big takeaway is for us to begin to challenge the narratives that we hear about our students and ask ourselves, is there a way to change that narrative so that it isn't from a deficit perspective? Because I think that's the perspective that we've got comfortable with. What is it that we don't have, as opposed to having the conversation about what it is we do have and what is good about our communities? Thank you.
Tell us, what is your recommendation for Mississippi when it comes to improving education?
I think the biggest one, which is no surprise, is to treat all students equally, to be very clear about how we treat that curious student, because the curious student is the student who's going to be able to identify what the next needs are by asking why. They will be the inventors. They are going to be the entrepreneurs because they're asking the right questions. Why does this work this way? What is it that my community needs? And we need to be mindful and not think of them as that troublesome child in the classroom.
The topic of my workshop is escaping the legacy of poverty through education and economic development. In this presentation, we are exploring career pathways and educational opportunities to lead Mississippians into the middle skill job market. This is essential because it provides a sustainable wage, and it provides a means of career expansion.
What kind of success have you seen so far?
It's been widely accepted. We're everything from community college CTE programs, as well as the movement of CTE coursework back into the secondary education system.
The topic of my workshop today is why educated persons are unemployed, and what I'm going to talk about is the nexus between economic mobility and economic development. because we are seeing a lot of research that tells us that kids are very limited now in certain areas of the country in terms of actually being able to make the American dream come true. They actually are stuck where they're born. So if you're born in poverty, you have a very low chance of moving out of poverty in some areas. And the Southeast is ground zero for that phenomenon. So when you think about economic development and actually bringing jobs, you need to invest in the young people to actually have an educated workforce to attract companies to come.
What is the best way to break that cycle?
The best way to break that cycle is really investment and high quality education. And those are all things we're talking about today. And so we do find that the investment is very different based on the race of the children and the return on investment for education. So if you have a college degree, you often make more money. But if you're African American and you have a college degree, you have a lower return on that degree and a higher chance of unemployment than if you were not African American. And so one of the things we need to address in the state of Mississippi is how do you equalize opportunity for folks who put in the same amount of effort?
The topic is student business development, and it deals with high school innovation and what we're experiencing around the state of Mississippi in that area. I work with about 500 students each year around the state that are interested in starting their own businesses, and we have a number of different types of businesses that have come out of that. Each year we end up with roughly 40 or more businesses that are launched from those students, and everything from service industry, the arts, it covers a wide gambit of areas.
How can entrepreneurship be one link to solve the problem of poverty?
Well, what you'll find is entrepreneurship, the level of engagement with entrepreneurship is directly correlated to lack of education. So nationally, you'll see that individuals with less than a high school education are more inclined to become entrepreneurs, and part of that's due to necessity. But providing those types of skill sets for our students so that they recognize opportunity around the state of Mississippi rather than trying to seek it elsewhere.
The topic of my workshop is Unequal Lives, the status of black women and families in the rural South. And it is connected to the MERC workshop in terms of how the economy affects education and vice versa, how education affects the economy. And I will be talking about how Mississippi's economy has been built on low-wage, low-skilled jobs, and if we are going to have an economy that's booming in this state, that we have to up the ante when it comes to educating our children to attract the kind of industries that are happening now in the 21st century.
What kind of success stories have you seen so far?
We are working in communities and trying to get economic development specialists to look at economic development in a different light. That it's not always about trying to land a smokestack, but we have to start investing in technology and in our children and things that would, one, draw industry, but two, allow young people to be self-employed as well.
The topic of my workshop is the role of race and ethnicity in the education process and how education plays into the job market, success in earning a living, but also in our financial lives. So I want to talk about some of the research that's been done recently that points out the key roles of race and place. And so it's especially important in Mississippi because of the historic difficulties, disadvantages that significant parts of the population have faced. And I am encouraged that there's some research that shows the way forward, I think, to make some progress. We're not going to solve all the problems immediately, but I think there are interventions that can be undertaken at every level of education, culminating at the college and post-secondary level, to make a real difference in people's lives.
The mission of MERC is doing what's best for children and their families. That's the overall concept. And I think it's certainly on point. One of the things that's key in public education that we focus on what matters most, and that's making a difference in children's lives and supporting their families in doing that.
I've just continued to learn information about education and economic development. I've learned that most of my beliefs and previous understandings concerning education attainment and wealth was accurate, kind of confirmed some of our thoughts and beliefs, especially as it relates to Mississippi in the rural areas of Mississippi.
One of the things that we know is that an education equates to economic development. I think that if you talk to any of our legislators in Mississippi, one of the things they always talk about is how is economics and education tied together. I think that our legislators have their view of how these two pieces are tied together. But if they could have been here this morning to hear these conversations regarding these two speakers, regarding economics, regarding the rich, regarding the decisions that are made that affect the everyday pieces that what we do, it would have been powerful. I think that this would have been a prime time for them to get a Cliff Notes version of economic development right when the legislative session is taking place.
The value of the MERC Leadership Academy is to focus on grassroots level issues in education that impact the advancement of student achievement, and also to go beyond that and to invoke a lot of thinking on the part of administrators about how to be creative and advancing education for students.
Why is education reform in Mississippi so important?
Well, we are at the bottom by design, and we believe as Mississippi goes, so goes the nation. It is important that we begin to be intentional about crafting solutions that work for all of our children, not just some of our children, and that's what we're about here at MERC.
What was your reaction to everything that you've seen and heard here today?
Oh, I'm excited. I think this is a uniquely different kind of conversation for most educators, because it's not so much about content knowledge, but we don't just live in a silo. We live in the whole world, and our ability to process information and to think differently is very, very important. And that's what today is.
If people have questions like more information about MERC, what should they do?
They should go to our website and send us an email at info@p3strategies.net. That's info@p3strategies.net.